And yeah, so again, thank you very much indeed for the time and generosity that we are hearing today. So I mean, by way of introduction, I just ask you to, I mean, I have some introductory notes about you, but aside from that, I would be thankful if you somehow tell me why you wrote this book according to your philosophical or like humanities background. So I have very short introductory note about each of you. So James William is honorary professor of philosophy and member of the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization at Deakin University. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong in the end, please. And Krista Bonello Rutter Giappone or Giappone, I was not sure, is a lecturer at the University of Malta and a member of the Center of Critical Thought at the University of Kent. Dieter de Klerk is senior lecturer in film and media and convener of the MA film program. Fred Francis is assistant lecturer at University of Kent and is the co-organizer of comics research firm Comics Crossroads. Iain MackKenzie is a senior lecturer in politics, also at the University of Kent. So I would be thankful and happy if you just, I start with James, if you don't mind, to tell me why you wrote about comedy. I mean, not why, but you have this background in the laws. You have written a lot of books on French philosophy, and why a book on comedy and critical thought.
Well, I didn't write the book for a start, but so I'm just a chapter contribution, and it interested me because it fitted into thinking through the relationship between signs, styles of thought, if you like, and affects in connection to systems such as political systems, societies. So that's what I was trying to put together in the chapter that I wrote.
All right, thank you. Krista, please. I mean, you edited this whole collection of articles.
I was doing a PhD on comedy, so so that was relevant, and I've always had an interest in critical theory, so this made sense. And we came together as a group and we discussed, I mean, our various interests, our common grounds, in order to, well, you know, organize the conference. And then, I mean, we had, you know, great submissions, great participation, and we felt the book was the right. We felt it would be a pity if a book didn't come out of it too.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Fred, please.
Yeah, so I guess I should correct or update your little bio of me. So I was, at the time we did this book, I was assistant lecturer at Kent. I just finished my PhD, which was focused on comic books and cartooning and the sort of practice of those, particularly looking at the way they related to a longer history of media, as particularly media that had been looked on as kind of lower quality or lower class, and how they sought to reframe that, how comic book writers sought and cartoonists sought to reframe comics and cartoons as something that could be considered kind of worthy of critical thought in themselves, I suppose. But actually shortly after that, the book was published, I left academia and I currently work as a video game designer.
All right. Okay, great. Sorry, I just repeated what was written in the book.
Yeah, of course. That was, 5 years ago or so, I think. Now.
All right. Okay. Okay. Thank you. And Iain?
Well, thanks, Maddie, and you know, thanks for getting us all back together again. It's lovely to see some you know, faces and friends that we haven't seen for a long time. So I mean, you know, my interest was really kind of spurred by Cree, by Fred, by Dieter, you know, who kind of effectively kind of came to me with my kind of critical thought hat on and said, well, what about comedy? And let's have a think about that. And it immediately kind of caught my interest. You know, in many respects, I've just been a fan of comedy. I'd never really thought about it, but you know, all those conversations and all the preparation for the conference and the work around the book kind of really convinced me that there's a really properly genuine problem around the relationship between comedy and critical thought. And it seemed to me that that was something we really had to grapple with. You know, I didn't want it to just be a kind of, you know, philosophy of comedy, although there's elements of that as well, but or just a kind of, how does comedy function as kind of critical stuff? I wanted to find some way of articulating a bit more of a problem that allowed for lots of different perspectives, and you know, the collaborators or co-conspirators kind of represented here, you know, really helped that along the way.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. And Dieter, please.
Well,
I mean, I thought you're the youngest person in the group. That's why you're.
Well, there was a time, and Fred will probably remember it well, where we kind of went to each other like, shall we organize a, you know, shall we organize a thing? And then that thing became multiple things. And I'm looking at a poster here in my office of a exhibition at the University of Kent Library, which Fred and I organized together on critical comics and cartoons. And you mentioned Comics Crossroads, which was a kind of series of events we organized together as well. And then with Cree and Iain, we started thinking about, you know, kind of the critical thoughts in that, and not just about comics and comedy. So that's a bit kind of the genesis of I guess the conference, which then translated into the edited collection, edited by Cree and Iain and Fred. You asked about philosophical, and like for me it'd be Socratic, like Socratic traditions with critical thought. And I did my PhD on kind of it turned into something around satire and mental health in the end. But there was quite a lot of writing at the time about the Simpsons in a Socratic tradition, and also kind of the kind of Socratic tradition that also developed into classical cynicism and Diogenes the Cynic. And so if you're asking about my philosophical kind of underpinnings of how I came at satire and critical thought, that's kind of where they are. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Great. Thank you. So as you know, I have like almost 15 questions, and actually I'm not honestly sure who to ask these questions. I just ask the questions. I would be happy if you have like multiple answers to one question. So I start with the first question, that is, I mean, by nature, critique takes place in distance, while humor functions in immersion. So how to write on comedy and critical thought then?
I'd be happy to kind of take the lead on this one, Maddie, if you don't mind, but then obviously, you know, others can jump in.
Definitely.
It partly kind of develops that idea that I think we all felt very clear about, which is that we needed to kind of set the agenda for the relationship between comedy and critical thought by trying to establish a relatively open problematic domain, something where we could invite lots of different perspectives, lots of different philosophical interests, but also lots of different thoughts about comedy, lots of different styles of comedy, all wrapped up as well in these other kind of slightly difficult terms like resistance and so on and so forth. So we wanted to just kind of create a slightly messy but hopefully interesting domain where we could invite lots of different kind of perspectives. I think we wanted that sense of there being a genuine problem. So I'm going to mention that again because, you know, for me certainly, part of that problem is that we can't take it for granted, if you like, that critique requires that distancing. It's obviously correct, I think, to say that, you know, part and parcel of the history of particularly modern European critical thought is that it's, you know, involved either that, let's borrow the kind of Harman phrases for the moment, that kind of overmining or undermining kind of approach. You know, you either reach for something, you know, above and beyond that kind of explains everything, or you reach, you know, deep down and look to find the, you know, the real underneath it. And those gestures, those distancing gestures, do often kind of define that kind of critical moment, or critical thought, generally speaking. But there's a tradition of kind of critical inquiry, trying to do what you rightly suggest, kind of, comedy and humor often tries to do, which is to kind of immerse itself into the moment, into the situation, and to try and kind of figure out, what it means to be in that situation, and either still be funny, or in our case, still kind of offer up some kind of critical thinking. And in that sense, the tradition is, kind of takes that immersive, it's a nice word that you're using there, that kind of sense of immersion, and kind of locates it around questions of immanence, typically. And then there's all sorts of dilemmas, quite frankly, about how one can be so immanently embedded in any given situation, and yet find some moment of kind of critical reflection within that. Hesitated over the word reflection because that's probably a little bit loaded, but just for the moment. And it just seemed to us, I think, as we were pulling this project together, that comedy, humor, laughter, all these different words that have slightly different resonances, but nonetheless kind of speak to something, often do have that moment of a kind of distancing, but also very much firmly, within, or immersed within that kind of given situation. And that in effect kind of establishes, I think, part of what we wanted to think about as, as the agenda for the book, as the problem kind of animating the conference. And then we kind of opened it up, and didn't want to be too heavy on insisting on imminent notions of critique, didn't want to be too heavy on thinking about too many notions of what counts as comedy, what doesn't, about challenges, conformisms, and so on and so forth. We just wanted to kind of create, I think anyway, that kind of space for inquiry around effectively exactly the problem you mentioned, Maddie. So that's really how I would think of that. It's there for us as a problem rather than as a kind of dichotomy that has to be kind of dealt with.
Wonderful, thank you. And any additional notes?
Yeah, I agree with everything Iain said, but I thought as well when I read this question, it's interesting that this is something we maybe don't frame it in exactly the way that you framed it here, which I think is probably better. But it's something that's kind of evident in the way we constructed the book in these kind of two parts. There's a first part which looks more at the critical traditions, and the second part which is much more focused on acts of humor in themselves, whether that's a particular tradition of cartooning or a particular comedian or something like that. And I felt that kind of tension that you're describing in a really positive way when we were working on this project, because coming from the background that I did, which wasn't a critical thought background, immersion in the historical moment of the thing that you're studying and understanding, particularly something like a pulp tradition as something that lives in a historical moment and can only be understood exactly in the moment that it's understood. You have to know everything about that and all the points that particular cartoon or comic book is touching. Feels like the right thing to do. So the critical lens was something I had to learn a bit more about, the distance of the critical tradition while I was doing this. And I think, I think the project is better for acknowledging both of these ideas and allowing them to coexist.
Right.
So just to add some examples, surrealism, Dada, situationism are all branches of critical thought that are immersive in their practices. And currently now, in terms of comedy, one of the most present all around us that's also immersive in our cities everywhere is graffiti, comic graffiti. There's also critical, or punk dressing. So I agree with everything that Iain said about not straight away taking the opposition that you presented around immersion too easily for at least a century.
All right, thank you. Beautiful examples. Yet in the book, you use the words comedy, humor, and laughter interchangeably. I mean, do you make difference between, like humor can invite more immersion than comedy? I don't know, like do you make any difference between your usage of these three words or concepts or genres.
If I could take my cue actually from what Iain said before, since we had such a variety, such a diversity of views represented, we kind of embraced a more inclusionary approach, I think, with comedy, laughter, even with one chapter, Selvin Yaltir's The Smile, just, again, recalling Simon Critchley's reminder to not neglect the smile as a response. So we do have laughter in some of our subtitles. We do have laughter, but yes, my sense of it was, we did embrace different approaches there.
All right.
I thought it was a nice moment when, reflecting on the shape of the volume, particularly as it was coming together, and trying to think about how we were going to articulate some of the connections, but also kind of disconnect in some respect between the wonderful chapters that we had. I was drawn back to this, for me, kind of really fundamental kind of exchange between Foucault and Chomsky, which is kind of peppered rather nicely by, in the kind of written versions that we have, these kind of square brackets that says Foucault laughs. And there was something there that I thought, okay, that's kind of interesting. Let's kind of play around with that. And it operates textually in different sorts of ways. So there are moments when he's kind of laughing with a view to kind of expose the formalities, the arbitrary formalities of the situation, of the conversation itself. And there are moments where his laughter also kind of invites the laughter of the audience into that process of, becoming aware of, and therefore being able to challenge, if you will, some of the slight arbitrary rules that are imposed by the whole setting, this kind of TV interview, but also arbitrarily imposed kind of through the whole conversation when, the lovely Fons Elders kind of says, no, Foucault, you've only got 2 minutes to answer. I mean, Foucault answering anything in 2 minutes is just quite funny anyway, as a thought. So, the idea that that notion of laughter was there, I think is quite interesting. And that almost, for me, allowed a little bit of that generous inclusivity that Cree was talking about there, where we could think about, okay, it's that sense of humor and comedy and so on as well, but that notion of the of the laughter kind of helped to me anyway to kind of settle on that as a usefully inclusive way of thinking about it. But then in the text, of course, we see lots of different ways of handling that, and I think that becomes really important.
All right, okay, go further to, the history of philosophy for a long time, for centuries, ignored humor. And then I just added that psychoanalysis started, or at least seemed to have compensated this ignorance. What is wrong with, or what is the Freudian analysis of humor? Because I see there are, I can ask this question from James. I would be happy if you answer this question. What do you think in the Freudian take of humor, on humor, or analysis of humor, or Freudian interpretation of humor and jokes?
It's a bringing together of a dynamic theory of pulsions like retentions, dams, releases, with one that's more strongly ones of signs and symbols and languages. And if you can have the right kind of clashes between let's say a symbol and a linguistic system, it can sometimes lead to comic release. And that release can be positive or negative, or in fact, it's always positive and negative. So the whole connection between this dynamism and structures with clashes and contrasts and tensions is what Freud brings, and is effective at showing how comedy and humour, less so satire and less so irony, have this kind of direct and emancipatory power sometimes, releasing and moving situations on. So that's what Freud brings in a very general terms.
And so you believe that irony can make use of it less than humor?
There's a less direct, in the sense of immediate effect on passionate release in irony. It's a slow burning fuse, irony. So that's where the difference is. And satire can have that direct effect, but often it's one that is at the same time more complex and can fool you a lot more. So satire, you think you got it and you missed it. And so there's a delay still in satire and how it works. So that's how I would start to distinguish them. It's a matter of timing.
Right. As you just put it, it can be, I mean, talking about humor, it can be emancipatory, not necessarily. That's the reason, probably one implicit message of the book. I mean, like, I can't say the book, some articles in the book is that it can be subversive, but it can also be conformist. Is it true?
Yeah, I mean, we had chapters on, you know, comedy as critique, but also, in a sense, chapters that invited us to take a critical distance towards comedy and laughter and humor themselves. Right? So, I mean, or discussing the limits, and that kind of includes Dieter's, even Nick Holmes and Evo's, and Pereira Martin's chapter, you know, and James's as well, but taking this critical approach, a critical distance towards humor and comedy. So so yes, we suddenly realized the limitations, and that is again an interesting question to unpack. I mean, I would say I would maybe use actually Haydn White's term for irony here, which is sort of trans-ideological. So in a sense, what we're talking about is also trans-ideological. I don't know if the others would like to add something, you know, again.
I would be happy, really, because I think that's a very important part of the book, in my opinion. I would be happy to hear multiple opinions about it. If
I mean, I'll something I think I can maybe be circled around back to the kind of Freudian perspective and this idea of, you know, what, you know, comedy is conformist or comedy is subversive. There's a metaphor that's often used, and, you know, comedy or satire as a safety valve. And it's a metaphor Freud doesn't use in relation to jokes, as far as I know, but does use it in relation to dreams. And it's certainly kind of part of the, you know, when people talk about the release or relief theory of comedy, it's often referred to as the safety valve. And this is something that since publication of the book I've explored together with Jihab al-Kashab, who's an anthropologist, and we were writing about Egyptian satire. And it's like, satire is a safety valve which is being imposed by the government so that all of this energy that could otherwise be turned into revolution, you know, is released, and therefore it is harmless. And it's just this kind of easy explanations of like some kind of easy causality, I think, are some of the pitfalls that, you know, when people talk about the impact of humor and comedy. I think it's maybe more complex than that. And so some like humor is a safety valve. And when you start really thinking about that metaphor, actually doesn't make any sense whatsoever, but it's presented as a kind of knockdown argument that, dictators, let satire roam wild because it allows them to keep dictatorships intact. So I think what Carrie was saying about it being ideological, that, comedy can have different kind of ideological perspectives. But I think it does things, but I doubt it topples governments or keeps them in place. I think so that's kind of where I would come in on that.
I think
right. If I'm allowed to add just something to what Dieter said, you just formulated it beautifully. But I guess that, although it's a very simplified analysis of this whole complex thing in satire and its relation to politics and power, I think that can also be, from my perspective, it can also be interpreted as a kind of antithesis or a reaction to this idea that I come here to Germany and say that, okay, people are in Iran, they laugh more and they are more humorous. That is also a bit of problematic statement. I was like, as I told you, like last month I was in Iran, and after, immediately when I sat in the taxi driver started making jokes. So it's a very ambivalent situation for me. It is, as you said, it is not going to topple down the government or regime, but on the other hand, it doesn't necessarily mean that Iranians are happier than Germans. That's I just wanted to add that point from a personal perspective, because Germans laugh less than Iranians. That's clear for me. We laugh more, and I don't know how to interpret it. From anthropological perspective, linguistic perspective, philosophical perspective, it's very confusing for me still. Yeah, thank you. I think Iain wanted to add something.
Just very general. Not so much on that particular point, although I think maybe it kind of taps back into it in due course. But I think we wanted to kind of step back from kind of definitive statements about comedy has to be this in order to be properly critical or in order to resist. It's kind of those kind of quite hard and fast definitions might be quite difficult, maybe for all the kind of contextual reasons you're saying. We need to understand more about what it is to be in that German context, what it is to be in that Iranian context, and so on, before we can really understand how comedy can function critically, and then possibly as well also as forms of resistance to whatever kind of authoritarian regimes we're talking about. Nonetheless, of course, we didn't want to step away from the invitation of the problem, which was to kind of invite people to have big and broad reflections on precisely that problem of kind of conformism and criticality or challenge and critique. Because in some respects you need that big claim in order to make sense of why we need to have the contextualist or situational or whatever perspectival kind of claims that we then want to make with respect to wherever we find ourselves in terms of culture, economy, politics, the artistic scene, whatever it is. So I think that kind of dynamic, if you like, between inviting broad accounts of how humor functions, how it can function in relation to criticality, at the same time kind of invited more particular reflections on local contexts. And Fred's already hinted at how that gets kind of split up in the book in some sort of way. We kind of manage that in the kind of construction of the collection itself, but also really kind of runs through as itself a kind of as a problem about how we make those, if you like, the big kind of claims about what comedy is and how it functions, and then the local challenges of really trying to figure out in any particular context. So I think there's something what should we say, kind of dimensional, many dimensions there to the problem that, you know, we were just inviting people to have a grapple with.
Right.
And, you know, your Iranian taxi driver would be another good example of a perspective on this that would, you know, offer up its own analysis and possibly its own kind of big thinking about comedy.
Yeah, I think if I can just add to that, I think there's something really particular about what Ian's just said and the situation you mentioned, Maddie, that is shared by, there's a chapter in the book that Pitt Gregory wrote about cartooning in the First World War. And one of the most interesting bits of that chapter is the idea that that type of cartooning was a way of reflecting on a shared experience, an intensely difficult experience, and the humor was often being used as a way of drawing people together, speaking about the shared experience people were having. And she points out that ideas like futility that we associate nowadays with the First World War are not very present when you go back and look at the cartoons that were written during the time. It was much more about promoting ideas like sacrifice or talking about shared personal experiences of things like a lack of food. And the idea of comedy as a way of bringing people together, of kind of elucidating a shared experience, seems to me one of these kind of functions that Ian's talking about that is incredibly personal, incredibly local, but something that we shouldn't ignore when we come to talk about, oh, is comedy subversive? Is it conformist? It almost kind of it draws away from that distinction by thinking about the idea that by drawing people together, that is what the act of comedy does. That is what the act of sharing a joke does. That's the first step. And then whether you've drawn people together in order to build resistance, or you've drawn people together to build some kind of conformity and shared, we're all in it together of a terrible political situation, what you've actually done is initially drawn people together. And that's the first thing that we should probably look at when we're analyzing these kind of comedic responses to particular and local situations. Right.
It also helps me to go to the quote I had from James. I read it that humor, I mean, I quote you, James, humor is not a state of passion and displacement. It is an ongoing process changing relations of affects and signs. It therefore needs dynamic models rather than fixed representations. I think it is quite applicable. I mean, this description also sort of confirms that it just draws people together, and it can bring people together in different ways. You know, like I would be happy if you explain, James.
Well, you can continue on from the conversation that we've had. So I was very uneasy with that conversation, and the reason I'm uneasy with it is because humor and comedy are also linked to many other different passions: cruelty, hurt, injury, silencing, fear, humiliation, and so on. And so drawing attention to the processes is drawing attention to the way in which you touch a spider's web and you move the whole web. So in analyzing something like comedy, in any given situation, you're going to have to trace networks and patterns of effects across structures, social structures, and I agree with what you say about politics, but also structures of affects, such as increasing fear, increasing self-censorship, for instance. And that's what I wanted to draw attention to in relation to interconnected processes. So I don't know if that explains what I was trying to draw attention to. And comedy is a very good example of this, because whenever you construct a group of insiders, you are always also constructing a set of outsiders.
Mm.
Right? And that's why often it's the politicians who are anti a universalist group who are also very good users of comedy, because they can use that comedy to divide the society. So in France, someone who's very good, unfortunately, at mocking others, like Éric Zemmour, who's an extremely divisive politician, is good at comedy. He's fast, he's snappy, and gets back at you. And there's an immense cruelty and damage to his use of mocking and divisive humor.
Wonderful. Yeah, great. I think Ian is going to add something.
Just to agree with James, and kind of, in a sense, kind of, thanks for the reminder, James. In case we kind of get a little bit too kind of comfortable around this. You're dead right. I mean, and I think that's something we need to always remember as we consider the functioning of comedy within any given kind of social situation. It can have all of those effects that you mention, and therefore all the kind of complicated outcomes you mention as well. I think it's therefore kind of nice to kind of remind ourselves that within that there is always the possibility for it to be kind of critical in the way of heading towards resistance. So that remains a possibility, even then, if we need to say, well, okay, but does that sometimes require it to be quite hurtful or quite difficult or quite problematic? And maybe one of the kind of slightly subterranean debates within the book is about what we might call the kind of normative kind of issues around kind of comedy, and indeed then all the other terms that we introduce as well around resistance and so on and so forth. Are we assuming resistance means a certain thing and it must be good? Are we assuming comedy means a certain thing and it must be good? And if we are, then what do we mean by that? And I think exactly what you're suggesting, James, would call that into question. Some, I think, of our contributors do make some of those assumptions, do see kind of comedy coming with a certain kind of value. But I also think that some don't, and they see it more as a kind of disruptive, opening up kind of space. I think of the Kate Fox discussion around humitas. It's quite a nice way she talks about how language, with its performative power, can open up that space. Now that may well actually be kind of cruelly opened up, but it can be opened up in a way that then, if I can put it gently or lightly, maybe allows for some possibility of thinking a bit differently that might begin to look a little bit like critical thought and so on and so forth. So there's too many hesitations there for us to be definite, but at the same time, yeah, I think it's one of the kind of subterranean debates within the book, and I'm really glad you brought it up, James.
I think if I may add to that, so I absolutely agree, and there is the dangers of collectivizing, obviously by excluding others, but there's also something wonderful about the solidarity that could be achieved. Now, I think perhaps one of the things at issue is the kind of collectivity that emerges, something that is also homogenizing, or is it something that admits dissent, admits heterogeneity, admits, with comedy, there's always a little bit of a danger because it's so inviting, it's so tempting to join the crowd in laughing, for example. And Sophie Quirk, who is also at Kent, had written a book on manipulation and stand-up comedy. Both the good and the bad of manipulation. Manipulation as a technique, really, too. But yes, you've got this, laughter as collective laughter, there can be something quite unsettling about that. And so, I think this might be one of the things to think about, like how far does that kind of collectivity allow for heterogeneity within it, allow for diversity, allow for dissent. So yes, I mean, there are these two sides to it, more than two sides.
There's a great example of that, because there's a technique in cinema around laughter, and you see it in many different films. There's a moment when you see a crowd laughing, and then using montage, they go to individual faces. And it's always a very awkward moment, because there's this moment of collective joy, and then you look at the faces, and the faces are suddenly unsettling and a bit frightening. And what are they exactly laughing at, and are they getting carried away? So I agree totally with what you've just said. Is that it's very difficult to place that collective. Mm-hmm. Sorry to interrupt. Didn't mean to. Yeah.
Right. Great. Actually, I was about to ask also, I mean, to ask another question about another philosopher who's written about comedy. I just didn't write in my questions. I just ask it in relation to what you just said about, I mean, your interpretation of comedy and humor. I mean, what is your understanding of, or what is your take on Alenka Zupancic's understanding of comedy in relation, because she puts comedy in relation to the absolute, and furthers her analysis. I mean, this kind of understanding is so much rooted in psychoanalysis, of course, but I would be happy to hear your idea about it.
Does anybody feel like they want to tackle that one?
That was very risky answering first. Iain, you're in trouble now.
Okay. I'm hoping it might deflect a little bit. That's what I'm hoping. I'm sorry, Maddie. I mean, I'm not entirely kind of comfortable with her work. I wouldn't want to kind of pronounce too much on that in terms of where I think that particular version of a kind of psychoanalytical approach takes us. Sorry.
All right. Okay. So that's one answer. Thank you.
Maybe we could refer to Francis Stewart's chapter, actually, because Stewart takes a route through the Lacanian and through Zupancic to look at the Easter liturgy. And that is actually quite an interesting and compelling argument, I think, that Francis Stewart makes. But yes, actually, it's been a while since I've directly read the book, so I'd rather I don't feel completely comfortable commenting directly on it. I mean, I could refer also to Jerry-Aline Fleiger's work, though, on again, sort of Lacanian, but also post-structuralist roots to comedy, the purloined punchlines. So again, we're dealing with things like short-circuiting and digressions and error, very interesting approaches to comedy and humor and their techniques, I feel. Yes. If anyone else would like to add something to this.
No, I edited Francis Stewart's chapter. I'm looking at it now and I remember editing it. I remember thinking, yes, his interpretation of Zupancic sounds exactly right. I'm happy with how he states our arguments, and I'm reading it now. I remember agreeing with it at the time, and I couldn't tell you any more about why I did or not. I think, yeah, we're suffering a bit, Maddie, from the fact this book was, or I am at least, a little while ago.
Right. I mean, sorry, just the question was a bit irrelevant, but since we talked about Freud, I wanted to see, I was just curious to see if from your point of view, as I mean, Alenka Zupancic or even Zizek, they add something to this Freudian understanding, because what is absent from their analysis is its process, is its affect thing, yeah? things are crystal clear and they come to, yeah. That's just out of curiosity I asked that question. Sorry, just it was a bit abrupt. I go further to like another question. Comedy cannot simply entertain; it's also a form of critique. You say that I'm quoting from the book, hyperbolic praise of satire's cognitive function and political impacts are therefore pernicious because they set the genre up for failure by introducing expectations it cannot uphold. In turn, satirists are forced to mitigate these expectations pragmatically, but often misconstrue the critical nature of satire in this process. I would be happy if Dieter could elaborate it, because here you talk about cognitive function and the careful cognitivism in regard to satire.
Yeah, it's a testimony to Ian's and Fred's kind of openness to various approaches that they allowed me to put it in the book. And so it kind of comes from an analytic tradition of philosophy of art, where if you think that you can learn something from art, you are a cognitivist about art. And so my position is that we can learn something from satire, but that we should be careful not to overestimate how much we can learn from satire. I think it's this kind of position that you allude to. I think when you go to the literature, you see a lot of kind of hyperbole about satire in particular, that it will change the world and give us the truth, or that it is completely the opposite, that it, keeps the status quo in place and that we can learn nothing from it, or that it's completely deceptive. And so I think what my account and other people's accounts, but I think I'm one of the people that tries to kind of occupy the middle ground a little bit. And to go back to the idea around, especially, I think, how we can learn from satire, and Fred was mentioning comics and cartoons. I think cartoons are really good at succinctly capturing information, and this is quite an established position in the field. And you might have something like the great cartoon history of the universe, which is like 3 volumes, and it's a lot of cartoons to read, but it's if you were to have a complete history of the world in books, you would have even more and more to read. And I think satire is very good, like cartooning. I think it's a kind of thinking that's really good at serving up like a succinct picture of a situation. And I think that can be really good because that can help you to get your head around an otherwise very complex situation. So I think it's really valuable in that sense, that you might, engage with a bit of satire about contemporary politics and kind of like, yes, that's it. But I think we ought to also be careful not to be seduced by that moment of, yes, that's it. That then would prevent us from doing, I guess, more critical thinking about it. And if you read the cartoon history of the universe and think like, yeah, that's it, I don't need to kind of read anything anymore about history, you'd be quite mistaken. And I'm towards the end, I kind of compare it a little bit to aphorisms in philosophy, where they can be kind of provocative because they really capture something very succinctly, but we need to do a little bit of, we shouldn't be seduced by that too much. And thinking something like Blade Runner, for example, to give an example of I think how that seduction could work, is that Blade Runner is a really great film, and it's also a film that makes us think, but maybe sometimes because it looks so good on screen, we might be seduced to think that it makes us, that it makes more complex points than it really makes. So there's this whole debate whether can film be philosophy? And there's probably a reason why philosophers write in journals, because it really allows you to think through something in a way that you might not be able to do so on the screen. But of course, the screen looks great. And because something is aesthetically seductive, maybe it is sometimes a little bit like seductive to think like, oh, that's it. It's nicely wrapped up. So to kind of summarize, I guess the idea is that, I think satire is a great tool to help us to learn about the political world and the world that we live in. But we should not be hyperbolic about what it does and does not. It's, I think, a tool. So that's kind of where I think I sit on satire, not just what we can learn from it, but also I think it's kind of what it can do in the kind of political realm in terms of protest and resistance. Really useful, but I think we should kind of make moderate claims, because if we don't make moderate claims, we set the genre up for failure, because then it's easy to say, well, satire doesn't do that, so it doesn't do nothing at all. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
But do you think, I mean, does it imply, probably that implies that there are a lot of people who exaggerate about like the function of satire, right?
Yeah, and if you look at the bibliography, there are. I mean, I think that these people aren't in the room today, but it just so happens to be a happy accident of scholarship that there have been lots of people that have made these hyperbolic claims. So it's been kind of a way of, I guess, negotiating a position in a debate. Yeah.
So, for example, satire is very good at showing the surface of things in relation to economics, for instance. So it shows too much wealth, things like that. But there are not very many good examples of satire showing how surplus value works. But if you're really going to want to change something, you have to understand how surplus value works. Not that the rich have got lots of money or have stolen it or don't like losing it or are mean. And none of that's going to work. The thing that you really need to understand is surplus value and its necessity within a certain kind of economic model. So there's not much good satire about that.
There is quite a good example, actually. It's funny you mentioned that in Red Rosa by Kate Evans, which is a comic book about Rosa Luxemburg. And there's a really nice moment in that, which is it's a cartoon retelling of Rosa Luxemburg explaining Marxism to, I'm remembering it now, to maybe some children. She's moving salt and pepper pots around to try and demonstrate surplus value. And I think it's funny that you mentioned that. That's the kind of example where I'm a big fan of being cautious about this, but we also shouldn't miss out the value in the ability of things to be simple, right? It's funny, what I like about Dieter's chapter is that it reconstructs this idea that there is some value, but we should be careful about it. But Dieter's arguing against these kind of grand claims for satire or cartooning that have been made. I think, from my perspective at least, a lot of the reason these claims were made is because the initial analysis of things like comic books or comedy is that they're not worth very much. People tend to overstate, oh, look, they can change the world, they can change governments, because they're traditionally considered low forms. But the reason they're considered low forms is precisely because they're easy to grasp. And we shouldn't dismiss that in itself as a value. It's great that they're easy to grasp. It's great that they can teach people things very quickly and very simply. That's an incredibly valuable thing to have if what you want to do is build resistances. And I think it's funny, it only came to me when James mentioned it, but the example of a comic book about Rosa Luxemburg is an act in that tradition.
That comic book isn't necessarily satire, right?
No, it's not satire. No, but sorry. Yeah, I took it away slightly from satire, but yeah.
Right. Great. I mean, although Kate Fox is not here, but there is a chapter, a very beautiful chapter I really enjoyed, where humor has been introduced as a kind of performative resistance. So what is Humitas? And if any one of you could help elaborate, is Humitas a performative resistance able to go beyond this dichotomy of playfulness and seriousness?
I think Kate Fox's argument is that it is able to go beyond, that it's able to go beyond the binary opposition. I mean, the word itself, right? The combination of fluidity, of humor, and the combination of that with gravitas, so weight and fluidity. And Kate Fox looks at how it's played out in playful activism, public performance, And it goes back to it goes to Bakhtin, but also Heisinger's theories of play and culture. And of course, that binary opposition isn't necessary. I mean, even in, the argument has been made that even in Heisinger's own work, that seems to set up the opposition. There was an article by Hector Rodriguez, I remember, in Game Studies, where he said, well, even in Heisinger, even Homo Ludens, seriousness and play sometimes co-occur, sometimes coexist, and Heisinger doesn't seem to rule it out. So I think Kate's argument is that we should not overestimate that opposition. I would agree with her.
Can I just put a little footnote onto that, which is maybe a kind of personal observation about why I enjoyed reading her chapter so much. And I hope she won't mind me saying, but it reminded me a lot of the kind of concluding chapter of Butler's Gender Trouble, where, again, we've got a theory about the performative utterance and what it's doing and how it's working and what's going on, and, challenging various forms of binary. And it's about articulating, it seems to me, this idea of humitas kind of articulates a space where seriousness and playfulness, as you've just said, Cree, kind of both coexist. One can be seriously playful and playfully serious all at the same time, such that one, both ends of that binary somehow kind of called into question and kind of pulled apart. And for me, that seems very powerful. However, I also kind of think that it's, and this would be then, my kind of critical thought kind of hat would kind of go, well, yes, but that probably does also have a certain set of limitations attached with it by virtue of still operating within a certain notion of binary, as I think kind of, the conclusion of Gender Trouble does too. But nonetheless, I think it's a really interesting way of articulating that there's not necessarily an easy resolution to this sense of humor that is either seriousness or playful, either going to change the world or just nonsense or just, mucking about or whatever. And that she's really trying to grapple with the dynamic between the two. I mean, I would kind of personally take myself more into the world of, James's kind of process philosophy, but working within those terms as they are, I think what she does is really interesting because it just kind of destabilizes our, sometimes initial kind of sense that we want to say, no, humor is deadly serious, or no, it's precisely because it's not serious that it's really important. And to do away with that, at least, I think is a really useful thing. Whatever one would then do with the notion of humitas after that.
Right. Yes, because it reminds me of the demonstrations around Brexit, but many others. So the losers had all the best jokes and all the best banners, but it was the monolithic rage that won. So,
yeah.
So I mentioned Brexit, and you silence.
So give me another sentence on that one, just to kind of,
The humour creates a complex assemblage that's mobile and fragile, whereas the monolithic rage creates for a moment, powerful block collective that has more political mass, right? So that's what I would be getting at. If I was going to be really provocative, I'd say humitas is bourgeois, in that kind of not going to quite carry it through way in our contemporary societies. So when there's big demonstrations now in France, it isn't so much that you have the different amusing banners and so on, but everyone's under the same banner that says something like "Soignante en colère," so a collective rage, and that's what's going to be listened to, not a carefully crafted, humorous togetherness.
I can see the sense in that, of course, but one's perhaps got to be a little bit careful about how we construct the notion of that which humour might operate against or resist, because one might, in a sense, be tempted to kind of create maybe an overly monolithic notion of what's going on there. It has its kind of machinic and assemblages as well, and of course they function by reproducing, and reproducing creates all sorts of avenues for difference to occur. So yeah, I completely agree with you in many respects, James, that there is that sense that we have to be wary of a simple appeal to kind of destabilization as something which will somehow take us to greener fields. I think that's definitely overstating it, and at the same time maybe just be careful about maybe not oversimplifying what is the complex nature of the rage as well, perhaps.
Sure. No, I agree with that. Absolutely. I'm trying to be provocative in a way. Yeah. There's often a certain nostalgia for 1968 slogans and banners and humour, forgetting that didn't really work out how it was supposed to, and the way it did work out was along much more cynical political lines, as you know better than me.
Yeah.
Sorry to just bring you again to some Iranian experience. Like I've witnessed by chance I've witnessed two different big uprisings in Iran. One was in 2009, this green movement in Iran, and the other one was last month. So in comparison, back then I experienced more humor in demonstrations, but this time I experienced more insult, and some of them, of course, were sexist insults or racist insults. So can I be more hopeful, James, that I heard more insults? I mean, my question is also provocative in this recent demonstration.
Sorry, James, go on.
There'd have to be an analysis of the power play. But I would say that there's a chance that you could be more hopeful, yes, because of the binds around that rage and that revolt are potentially stronger. So there's an expression in French demonstrations, jusqu'au bout, right to the end, right? Now, jusqu'au bout is going to, right to the end. We're going to carry this through, whatever it takes. Seems to be stronger to your description of the second set of demonstrations. But that's just a superficial analysis. I mean, it's just a remark.
I just asked that also in relation to what Patrick Metziger in the book Political Humor or Humor in Politics. But there is a chapter I just mentioned, humor in the Volksgemeinschaft. There he talks about humor in the Third Reich as a kind of coping mechanism, what Dieter also talked about in the beginning. But it is not. It is something that I'm not that. I don't find it that strange. I mean, this analysis where in Iran, once Ahmadinejad was our president, people were just making jokes about him. and nobody was acting. And I can go even that far to say that humor can, I mean, also another superficial analysis from my side, that humor can be a sign of undemocratic society, where anger in Germany can be a sign of democracy. I mean, this rage that exists in day-to-day life. Of course, I don't like it. I don't like anger in this society, of course. Affectively, they don't like it. But politically, it's understandable to me that, you know, like people react. But in, yeah, that is another, sorry, that was another.
Can I come in on this idea of coping? And then I think I'm going to have to, I kind of scheduled an hour for this, and I've got.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So I think that's really interesting, that this idea of coping, and I think I'd like to just say something about it, because I feel like it's like, if I want to say something about satire in particular, this is probably the thing. So I like to consider like satire as like an artifact, like a hammer, something that you can actively do something with. You know, and somebody can use a hammer to bang nails into the wall, fix a television, probably not such a effective tool for that, and you know, use it as a weapon to attack people. I think it's quite hard to say what people do collectively with hammers. Like, you know, the British do hammers that way. So I think these kind of sweeping claims for me are a bit tricky, but you can say that that hammer is a really useful tool that has been designed in a certain way to do certain things with. So I think satire, the way it's been designed, I think is a useful tool to kind of, I want to say, cope with the world, but then it, you know, how do you understand coping, right? And for me, coping is not acquiescing. Coping is not just accepting. So, you know, a model in psychology, the transactional model of coping is that, you know, sometimes you're just presented with a situation where you don't have the resources to resolve this problem at once. Climate change, you know, like how, you know, coping with climate change doesn't mean that, you know, you don't want to do anything about it anymore, but it just means dealing with a situation that you don't have the resources with to resolve at once. And sometimes you also need to kind of maybe take a little bit of distance from that to kind of recharge your batteries, which is something that, you know, psychologically, you know, that transitional model of coping accommodates. So these kinds of, you know, and this brings me back to what I said about satire in relation to a safety valve. Sometimes the understanding of like satire as therapy or coping has been framed that it is a safety valve that just allows you to get rid of all of that emotion that would otherwise manifest itself into political action. Whereas I think it's probably something a little bit more complex that's going on, and something that, you know, people individually and in groups, you know, use satire as a tool, probably in different ways, but it affords particular kind of uses. And I think, like, you know, coping with a world that is sick beyond full repair, for me, is one of those things. And, you know, that I think sometimes involves taking a little bit of distance, but then also like being, you know, remaining critical, remaining to protest for political change. And yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it. And yeah, I thought I wanted to share that before but you know, just picking up on that notion of coping.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Are you going to leave us now, or?
No, I can stay for a bit longer, because I feel like I've kind of thrown something into discussion if people want to
great. Yeah.
respond to it.
So could I ask you, would you associate coping with acquiescence or agreement?
So I mean, not personally, but sometimes in the literature, one of the kind of polarized, you know, one of the poles is like satire topples the government, and the other one is like satire helps us to acquiesce, to just accept the status quo. And so for me, the way I understand coping is not just accepting that nothing can change, you know, because that seems to feel like, yeah, you know, we don't need to do anything anymore. For me, it's a more complex, you know, negotiation of like, you know, these typically when we talk about the kind of topics that were discussed in the books, they're not problems for which there is an easy fix, typically. And so we need to deal with that in some way. And so I think it's like this dealing with is how I understand coping. Yeah.
Yeah, Iain?
I wonder if I might just kind of circle some of this around in a slightly different way by kind of coming at it from the point of view of the apparatuses of political power, and then kind of thinking it down that way. I mean, if we just take a kind of very, back of the envelope kind of Foucauldian kind of approach to this, and we've got, sovereign societies becoming disciplinary societies, add in our Deleuzian postscript becoming control societies. Well, we know there's a rough, I mean, geographically specific, but nonetheless a rough sense of historical change there. But there's also, of course, a sense for Foucault, as there was also for Deleuze, a sense that these moments overlap very, very much. I mean, we have sovereign elements to this day as we become in control. We still have disciplinary elements, and in some, putting it very crudely, in some respect, the kind of the National Socialist movement in Germany, of course, kind of brings the sovereign and the discipline into a complete lock, where that absolute sovereign authority is matched with a complete disciplinary control of all the institutions, and therefore all this kind of subject positions within it. But what I'm really want to focus on there is that if we think about these different kind of sketches of social and political power, we think about how different it is to resist those. If you're resisting sovereign power, you need to claim freedom. But if you're resisting disciplinary power, you don't claim freedom because you have the freedom. That's partly what it gives you. Right? You do instead, we've heard about 68 already, you look to transgress. That might feel like it has an element of freedom to it, but it might not. And it's not necessarily the same thing. And of course, partly what's at stake there is that the freedoms won through the challenge of sovereign authorities become the very bread and butter of the disciplinary institutions that then, kind of need to be established ever more firmly. And similarly, in the world we're in now, it seems like, we've got this sense in which if we kind of proclaim transgression, then we're not really going to do anything other than, as kind of James alluded to, further substantiate the kind of regimes of control, because that's where they came from. They came from our transgression of disciplinary models. So, the more we transgress, the more we will be controlled. And as Deleuze famously says at the end of the postscript, I don't know, we need to find the new weapons. So what are the new weapons now? And this is where I think I can circle back round to what kind of, using different words, of course, but satire, comedy, laughter, irony, I mean, these might all have importantly different functions in this respect. One broad sense for me is that they are part of an experimentation. They open up this space for us to try to figure out what the new weapons are, whether we need the hammers now or whether we need something else, or whether we need, how do we figure out what the right ways of resisting control be, if even resistance is the right word in that sense. Is hacktivism, just really another form of conformism rather than radical challenge? Or, should we be throwing our kind of technological, iPhone related clogs into the machines of the algorithms? Or is that just, old fashioned and we need to think other ways to do it? I think humor, broadly speaking, comedy and its varieties, helps us figure out what it might be that we need to be picking up in any given situation. And I wouldn't presume to kind of suggest what the kind of Iranian kind of situation is if we were even to use those kind of simple kind of sovereign disciplinary control kind of terms. But I'm sure you'd have some sense, Maddie, of where that would fit, and therefore what humor might offer as a space for experimentation to figure out what it means to resist in that situation.
Right. I mean, can I add to that, or can I claim that a satire that is made now in Iran about like the relationship of a mullah to the hijab of a woman, it cannot be necessarily a kind of political act when it is published in Germany. I mean, like if we if you think of this difference between like sovereign, disciplinary, and control societies in that sense, there is definitely for me a difference between Germany and Iran. I mean, we are claiming for freedom in Iran, like, yeah, but here, probably either transgression or something more than transgression is required. So that's why I'm not that much positive or even optimist about like these kind of satires about Iran here, mixed with Islamophobia or any kind of other discourse, yeah, in a different constellation. Do you agree, Ian? I mean, is it sensible?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think, you know, my guess is that it is precisely about freedoms in Iran, and therefore, and it should be, you know. But I'd also kind of invite us to think about how in any national context, of course, what we're looking at are a variety of kind of social, political, economic, cultural, religious institutions. And the complexity of those institutions might mean that one needs to be on the streets proclaiming freedom, but at the same time, one needs to be in one's local community centre, looking at how one's going to transgress discipline and control. But there might still be that level, a kind of subnational, if you like, kind of level of negotiating what forms of resistance are appropriate, given the modes of control. And, you know, one of the maxims of this kind of post-structuralist thought, if you like, is that, you know, in a sense, you have to also try the resistance to figure out what the form of control is. And, you know, there's a bit of a navigation in order to kind of find you know, the spaces for a bit of experimental thought that's ongoing at all sorts of levels and in complicated ways that don't make it easy for you to be, you know, proclaiming your freedom in one sense, but at the same time looking to do something else that is effectively acknowledging your freedom, but looking to go beyond it in another. And that's a difficult place to be, you know, as a human, let alone as kind of, you know, various kind of transnational collectives and so on.
So can I take you back just a little bit? You used the phrase "helps us figure out," but what you've just said sounds like "helps us act out." Which would it be?
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, I have a kind of grounding assumption here that, you know, we kind of change, you know, we only come to know the world by changing it. So in that sense, I definitely want to move towards the act in order towards the knowing. So I would like, you know, I'd like to kind of proclaim in that sense a certain methodological role for acting in the world. And I think comedy, you know, can in many respects kind of fulfill that role, actually kind of help us figure out what the change is that can help us know. And that's got to be a very much a dynamic process as well, James.
Right.
Sorry, can I, because I'm interested in punk comedy. That was my PhD was on punk comedy and punk influenced comedy. And we actually have a chapter in the book by Russ Vesky on punk comedy and punk parody. But in punk, and in a sense, that was a subculture where they were trying things out. But one of the things that really interests me is that there isn't a standard opposition between anger and humor. They go hand in hand, and I find that I found that quite interesting because it's not. It isn't. I mean, it's not the obvious coupling, right? But it can be a really potent one. And again, this is just to challenge certain binary oppositions and to point to perhaps one of the pretty short-lived, unfortunately, like subcultural experiments, if you like, not short-lived in its legacy necessarily, but in kind of what is often seen as like late 70s, a kind of what is sometimes seen as a kind of enclosed stage of punk. I mean, we definitely can be challenged, right? When does punk begin? When does punk end? I'm not going to I'm not going to like specify or define the period here, because it has been and can be questioned and discussed. But there is that I suppose in the quest for something raw as well, there is that very angry humor there.
And you don't mean anger as funny, do you? You mean
no. I mean, so Bestly actually discusses parodies of punk in his chapter 2, which is also, you know, so there anger would be funny because it's a parody coming from people who are not sympathetic to punk necessarily. No, but for example, in the punk sneer or the smirk, there's a certain attitude there. There's also sometimes outspoken anger about social issues, not always. Sometimes, and it could have been even more direct than it was, but there is this anger in the attitude, anger in the in the refusal to engage sometimes, that is coupled with a kind of, it's something, perhaps it's humor as critical distance there. So the anger suggests perhaps we could use the word immersion as it was used at the start. I hesitate to use the word immersion, but we could. So anger suggests a different kind of direct relationship, perhaps, whereas the humor suggests more of a critical distance to that. But they seem to go together in punk in the kind of commentary that they build, the kind of critical commentary that is, you know, not entirely coherent, no. But really interesting.
I am gonna have to go now, I'm afraid.
All right,
something
okay.
at 4:30. But I didn't want to go before saying thank you to you all, and thank you to you, Maddie, for
My pleasure.
bringing us together for a very stimulating conversation.
Thank you.
All right, sorry guys.
Thank
See
you.
you soon.
Have a
Bye-bye.
great evening. Bye. Actually, I have like lots of questions come to my mind, like spontaneous and written questions, but I just like try to stick because I don't want to really take a lot of time. Just I go to the, I think here there is a code that perhaps is not that irrelevant to what you just said, Krista. I quote, no doubt humor can act as pain relief, Novocaine for the soul, but rather than get hooked on that, we think it better to use humor in the way Sweet Love does in the end. I mean, the character that is named there, to try to build solidarity, to create something publicly and collectively felt as intolerable, absurd, something more directly and intersubjectively experienced, and therefore something that can no longer be ignored. Chris, do you think that it can happen through this combination of anger and humor, this solidarity?
Yes, I mean, again, I mean, I wrote about punk, and it was not always clear how far. So, you know, I mentioned earlier the homogenizing effect that could be created by collectivizing, but punk, at least in many of the examples that I've looked at, punk tended to leave that space for dissent, I felt. So there was the anger, there was the solidarity, the collectivity, but it also went hand in hand with an emerging individualism. And that is present in in sort of UK punk from the late 70s. So there is a lot of tension. There are a lot of tensions at work there. I think it was, in some ways, it was experimenting with this kind of, with what could be done in that line, right? And then post-punk went even further into a kind of more, in some ways, a less collectivizing kind of attitude. I mean, I don't have like a single straight answer to this, because I think like it's there are a lot of tensions there.
Right. Please.
Oh, Maddie, sorry if you don't.
No, just
you've made an excellent connection. Chris really kind of worked it up very nicely, which is that last chapter from Adrian, Juliana, and Robert is it's kind of punk in attitude. And I think that's a really nice kind of way to think about it. It's only a few years ago. They're definitely not hanging out in their ripped t-shirts and with safety pins, but there's a kind of punk attitude to it. And there is something kind of intriguing about how that example that they give is really the equivalent of the Sex Pistols on TV. This is an example of just being effectively in an academic meeting and just calling it out for what it is. And it is angry, but it is also really funny. And that idea that there's something very kind of punky about just being in the meeting and going, do you not all see what we're doing here? Do you not all see how the glances are operating across the room? Do you not all see, why someone's going to beat a sweat and someone doesn't? And, all that kind of stuff, which is very, very interesting. And I think that the kind of motif, in that last chapter is a kind of this sense of a kind of strident public rebuke, which on the face of it doesn't sound very funny, but then we're not just talking funny, we're talking, the kind of broader sense of kind of how we can establish bonds here through those kind of public rebukes. But of course, you'll only establish the bond if the other people in the meeting feel that it's similarly intolerable. And actually, many of them won't. Many of them will think it's a darn fine meeting where lots of good things are being sorted out. But those who do feel it's intolerable will rise to the kind of strident public rebuke and feel a certain sense of, as they put it in the chapter, a certain sense of sympathy and solidarity. So we get both that level of affect and that level of kind of, what should we say, kind of consciousness raising, more kind of political sense of solidarity as well. But it's definitely very punky. It's a punky thing to say, let's turn the self-help manuals into kind of critical, make them the contemporary banners or the contemporary version of the graffiti you would spray in the meeting room. I mean, that's a weird and punky attitude, but I think it's a very interesting one. And it is, again, for me, in reading their work, it's a kind of experimental response to that particular form of social and political power that is definitely edging more to control and less to discipline. And they're just trying to find out, what it is that we have to do here, and maybe bringing the self-help manual into the meeting and turning it into this ostentatious, masochistic public rebuke is something which will help us figure out how to resist control.
But I don't see how the laughter and the comedy contributes to the intolerable. So when I hear you and I think of the punk and so on, really the moment of humor is often a bit like that. Oh, you're right. What are we like? But as soon as you've done that, you've moved away from something being intolerable to a certain kind of complicit understanding. So
couldn't agree more, James. I mean, that would be my my sense of the the Michael McIntyre routine, when he kind of goes on about all the spices we have in the back of our you know, of our cupboards that, you know, we take from house to house to house, and we all go, oh yeah, I've got those spices too, you know, and we kind of feel, oh, that's funny because I've got them too, you know. I mean, if that's what it was, then of course it's absolutely at the conformist end of this whole thing. And I wouldn't necessarily, particularly given some of our comments about being cautious here, I wouldn't necessarily overstate the disruptive effects of that strident public rebuke, you know, drawn from, you know, the pages of self-help manuals in you know, departmental meetings. I mean, that can have its own conformist elements too, and I think particularly at the level of thinking about economic systems and so on, which you know, they're very aware of. But equally, something about that. Let me slightly shift register. Forgive me for doing so, James, but shifted towards kind of making the absurd kind of present in the room is something which, you know, I think does have us going. I really genuinely don't know why I've just listened to the last 10 minutes from, you know, our academic manager spouting off about, oh, well, all I heard were excellence said several thousand times, and I don't quite know what the other words were, you know, and something absurd about that becomes more open and visible to us, I think, as someone, simple terms, kind of calls it out, maybe. And it's shocking and funny all at the same time, I think.
We're talking about sort of how to take the next step beyond awareness, right? Because we can achieve that awareness. And by the way, I wanted to mention Oliver Double has also written about the collectivity of laughter, also at the University of Kent, collective laughter and the dynamic of that. But yes, I mean, the burst of satisfaction, the burst of recognition, the shared reassurance. How do we go beyond that? How do we take the next step? That's basically what we're coming back to.
Well, actually, the reason that really caught my attention, and I just asked that question about the relation between humor and anger, was that, I mean, what is a bit still unbelievably strange for me, although very human here, is this experience that people laugh when they feel safe. And only when they feel safe, they laugh. And I have a lot of experience of laughing in danger and laughing when I don't feel safe. And that's why I just found it interesting in punk culture that this togetherness, this simultaneous feeling of even fear and anger and laughter and humor together can be combined. You know, like going to a stand-up comedy club on the weekend when I feel absolutely safe and comfortable with my friends, and when I'm drinking, you know, it's another experience than like laughing when you are, you're threatened or you're angry or you're scared. That's why I was interested, and I'm still interested in such combinations of different affects that happen together. You know, like it's very easy to disintegrate humor from other affects and go to I don't know, like sit down like this watch a comedy and laugh, you know, on your own. Then because that's why I understand when you say that it is less collective and more individualistic in that sense, you know.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. That's very interesting, because gallows humor is because that isn't a form of coping as agreement or acquiescence that would be viewed as negative, gallows humor, because gallows humor is making a situation that's doomed and indeed intolerable for a moment tolerable. So I think that's what you're describing is gallows humor. that in that moment of danger.
But sometimes gallows humor signals a kind of acceptance, right? Whereas anger doesn't.
Yeah, I guess it depends on your view of death, really. Whether that acceptance is a bending or a final revolt, I don't know.
Fair enough.
Sorry, yeah.
Sorry, Maddie, my apologies. I was just digesting that. In some sense, I wonder if it's that moment of gallows humor is a kind of, I forgive the slightly corny metaphor, but a kind of, you know, throwing of the pebble into the pond of the future. You go out with an event, you go out with an utterance, you go out with something that's going to, you know, quite, you know, actively live beyond you. You know your death is coming, but this, you know, he or she said as they were about to have their head chopped off, and it lives and it goes on. To what end, I'm not sure, and to what value one could challenge it, of course, and think it through. But I just wonder if there's a certain reaching out beyond one's inevitable fate in that certain kind of making a joke of it.
No, absolutely. I can't agree more. And the only thing is that, I mean, one of the affects that's usually overlooked in relation to humor, laughter, is courage. I mean, yeah, the relation between courage and humor. Not that I am actually, I absolutely agree with what you say. That this is another, I don't know, another constellation, another exchange that is also of interest to me. Yeah, Fred wanted to say, sorry, Fred, I just...
That's all right. It'll derail the conversation a little bit anyway, but it kind of occurred to me while you were speaking, and I'm at the risk of being seduced by Blade Runner, as Dieter mentioned earlier, but it seems to me in this discussion of the way that humor can coexist with other affects, one of the most useful things we can look at for the future is the way in which the mechanisms of control that we are and will become subject to are becoming increasingly roboticized, right? And as tools like automated sentiment analysis are become more and more sophisticated, the ability of things like humor to coexist and deliver anger, or to coexist and deliver courage, and to be seemingly one thing and actually be another, that is, I would guess, I'm reading my crystal ball here, going to become even more of a powerful feature of humor in opening up discussion, in creating the space for us to think differently that Iain mentioned earlier, because we will have to become more and more aware of the fact that to be explicitly angry is to activate the machine. So that, I'm thinking, I haven't got further than that in my thinking about how humor as an affect coexists with these other affects, but the value of the fact that it does seems like this will be increasingly important in building resistance in the future.
Yes, exactly. So more and more inventive and subtle forms of display, and that's already appearing in popular culture and the way it's picked up, and different signs and so on that people use. I think you're completely right. That there will be an inventiveness about that kind of display, and the signs and symbols we use to escape that quick analysis of apparent emotion.
Does this speak, James, to your work about process? I mean, you know, I suppose my slightly kind of t-shirt worthy approach to this would be, you know, process will always outstrip procedure, if by procedure we have in mind something like the algorithmic if-then procedures. They have inputs, they have outputs, and whatever's happening in the middle might be, you know, more complex than, you know, Federal Reserve Bank chiefs can comprehend, but nonetheless they are input-output if-then processes, just kind of complicated. Procedures. Whereas processes, back to your spider's web, are always in principle infinite. Is that right?
The infinite, ongoing, already destroying themselves. But that's also true of procedures. That's the thing, is that procedures are in fact processes.
Yeah.
And they're erected as procedures and as having a certain static validity. And the classic example of that are psychological theories of whatever. This is how we are. It's extraordinary how quickly they go out of date and have over a very long period. So yes, so I agree. I'll buy the T-shirt.
Guys, I think I asked many more questions and than expected, because it was a very enriching and illuminating exchange. I enjoyed both the book and the talk to you. It was wonderful, and I express again my gratitude and thankfulness for your time and generosity. I would be happy if there is any point, any comments from you all in the end.
Just to say a massive thank you to you, Maddie, to you, Kree, as well, particularly for kind of mediating. And it reminds me what a thoughtful, reflective, joyful, difficult, but wonderful space this kind of conversation is. And actually, it's been really lovely. Thank you.
I agree.
Thank you.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely agreed.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
And yeah,
Thank you. Bye.
yeah, goodbye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.